My name is Sarah Rooker, and I'm the director of Norwich Historical Society, and I'd like to welcome you all here to First Wednesday. The first thing, I bet you can all guess what I'm going to say, which is to please make sure your phones are all off or unmuted. First Wednesdays is a program of the Vermont Humanities Council, and it's co-hosted by the Norwich Historical Society and the Norwich Public Library. First Wednesdays is supported statewide by the Vermont Department of Libraries and the National Life Group Foundation. And tonight's event is being presented with the Dartmouth College History Department. The Historical Society and the library would like to thank our generous supporters, including the Friends of the Norwich Public Library, the Jack and Dorothy Byrne Foundation, Ledyard National Bank, Mascoma Savings Bank, and Norwich Historical Society. This is going to be a special evening. I can say so with great authority because I just spent a magical hour and a half at Norwich Historical Society with David Hackett Fischer and a group of teachers, hearing all about his work and future work and why we do history and what it's all about, and it was a wonderful evening. And he is going to have much more to share with you tonight. He assures me that we didn't tire him out. First, though, I'd like to introduce to you Bob Bonner, who is the chair of the History Department at Dartmouth, who will be welcoming David.
Great. So I think Sarah was supposed to introduce me. I'm going to introduce David. David will introduce Paul Revere, right? Anyway, I'm here really wearing two hats. First, as the representative of the History Department at Dartmouth, a statement of support for this kind of programming. In a moment where the value of our public life and thinking about the American stories is questioned in some corners, as an institution, the History Department really finds great value in partnering in these sorts of endeavors. I also took part in the pre-game here, and you have a treat in store for you. Let me just leave it at that, and then really try to do this very quickly so you can get to the main event. In terms of introducing David Hackett Fischer, who I've met tonight for the first time, it's one of the reasons I really was looking forward to this introduction, was a chance to meet David. Can draw not just on the fact that I'm the chair of the department, but I'm also an American historian. And so let me just say just a few things here just to signal and convey to you the immense scope of David's work. I suppose we know him best as the winner of the Pulitzer Prize in 2005 for Washington's Crossing, which is quite a read. But my introduction to David came when, at the time of being a graduate student collecting books, you're still in the buying book stage, and this was some 20 years ago. And Historian's Fallacy certainly was one of the first books I thought I should lay my hands on, devoting myself to a professional career as a historian. That's just such a neat little book from 1970. Through graduate school, trying to master a wide range of things, being familiar both with his early work on the New England Federalists, and also his breakthrough book that I know many of you are familiar with because as teachers you've introduced it to your students, the Albion Seed Project. But beyond that, the one thing I'd like to also sort of throw in the mix here, because I think it does testify to David's inspirational nature in terms of really charting where we're going as a historical profession, is the leadership role he's played in doing things like Paul Revere's Ride, Washington's Crossing, but also a whole series of books on pivotal moments in American history. This is a project that he's led and has introduced the value of the finely crafted episode as a means of engaging with the American past. And to that end, it actually inspired me, not in my own work, I haven't done one of these books, but to recreate the survey course for Dartmouth undergraduates around the whole notion of turning points in American history. It's a really wonderful way for people to engage with both the texture and the individuals and the characters in such a way that lends itself to the sort of storytelling magic of the American past. And so that's something that I'm really deeply indebted to David and his work for modeling as a means of thinking about the past. I could go on, but I really don't want to. There's so many other modes in which David has done his historical work. I'm just scratching the surface here. The episodic and the biographical, the finely wrought tale is going to be presented to you tonight in terms of the story of Paul Revere's ride. So with that, please join me in welcoming David Hackett Fischer.
It's a great treat to be here. Let me begin with an introduction of my own. The word "we" will be deployed here this evening, and "we" refers to Judy and me. And where is Judy? She came with me, and there she is in the back. And Judy is a biologist, a botanist. We met in graduate school at Johns Hopkins in 1959 and married, and we've been historicizing and botanizing and biologizing together ever since, and I get to go on some of her adventures, and I don't know that historians have adventures in the same way, but she's been very much a partner in all the things that we've done, and she also is the brain of the operation, I should say. So, but when we checked in at the inn here, the innkeeper said, "What's your topic tonight?" And when I answer that question, I usually watch his eyes glaze over. But I said, "It's Paul Revere's ride." He said, "Paul Revere's ride." And there was that instant response that often comes when I travel in the company of Paul Revere. I do a fair amount of teaching in retirement homes. And I observe that people who are who are challenged in their memories will often recall the poetry that they were compelled to memorize in the 3rd grade. And the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere is one of the last things to go. And it's really, it's an inspiration to see that. They recite it by the stanza with great pleasure for them. Well, this is a story that has been told many times, though until I had a go at it, there had never been a serious history of Paul Revere's ride. There had been many other things. There are operas, there are cantatas, but there had never been a careful study that way. The story has been told in many other substantive ways, and it's an example of two themes that are very strong in this culture. One of them is it's a new word that I think was invented in Massachusetts, which is filiopietism, the celebration of one's forebears. And the other is a word that was invented, it was said by Henry Ford, and the word is debunking. And Paul Revere is a story that Americans love to celebrate and equally love to debunk at the same time. And the classic celebration was, of course, the Longfellow poem. And it was a story with a moral. It was about Paul Revere as a solitary loner. In the poem, he waits alone for the signal from the Old North Church, and then he makes a solitary ride all the way to Concord in the poem, and he awakens every Middlesex village and farm in that same individual way. And this was told by Longfellow in 1861. And the moral was that one man alone could make a difference by his service to a great cause. And it was meant to be a contribution to the Union war effort in that way. And then the great example of the American debunker was Mark Twain. And he told the story in another way. He made the horse into the hero. He had a great contempt for historians in general. He called us antiquarians, and he said every year antiquarians shed new darkness on their subject. He said if they keep on, he said we know little enough as it is. He said if they keep on, we will know nothing at all about history. And the moral of his story was beware of stories with morals. Was Mark Twain. I could go on at length about other stories with other morals and other debunkers as well, but I want to return to what actually happened. When I think about this event, and there are others like it, and I'm going to end today after we look at Paul Revere with a quick look at another one of these stories, which is Washington crossing the Delaware, which is in some ways comparable in its structure. And when I have a go at these things, I think of there's a German pianist named Arthur Schnabel, and he was sitting down to play Beethoven's sonatas. And he turned to the audience and he said, "This music is better than it can ever be played." And I think one could say that these are stories that are better than they can ever be told. And we keep discovering new possibilities in that way. So I started burrowing into the Massachusetts Historical Society, and I was amazed at what I found. I knew there was a collection of Paul Revere papers there, and quite a lot of material came out in that accustomed form. We found other things as well. There is, in the Massachusetts Historical Society, there is a massive collection of diaries that were kept by the hundreds in New England, and Massachusetts in particular. And these diaries have now been, first they were microfilmed, and now they're being digitized. And it's a fairly simple matter to get into them and search them in large numbers quickly. And there were hundreds of them that were kept on the 19th of April in 1775. And every diary, without exception, made some reference to that event. It was called always by the same name, or almost always, and the name was the Lexington Alarm, the Lexington Alarm. Sometimes Paul Revere was mentioned, mostly not, but people knew about the writers. They got the word in that way. And this was a sort of memory that has a special quality to it. I think most of us have a memory of that sort about where we were when we got the news of 9/11, or earlier where we were when we heard that John Kennedy had been shot. And I'm just old enough to remember where we were when we heard the news of Pearl Harbor. I was 5 years old. My brother and I were recuperating in our bedroom. We had been sent down in those days. We were sent to have tonsillectomies, whether we needed them or not. And my brother and I were both sent in to have I think my parents got a cut rate on tonsillectomies. We were recovering, and while we were lying there on a Sunday afternoon, my father came up and he told us the news from a place we had never heard about, Pearl Harbor. But there was something in the way he told that story that caught the mind. And the nature of that memory is such that I can remember the entire surroundings in that same thing. I think if you think about where you were at 9/11, you will have that sense of recovering the context as well as the news of that event. And this was a warm December afternoon in Baltimore, and there were roses blooming under the window, and I can still see them. And that's what these special memories have, and it's a great opportunity for a historian because they are remembering the entire setting when they put down the memory of the Lexington alarm itself. And that's one thing I began to dig into, looking for the way in which this event actually happened. And I looked at other things as well. I wanted to know more about Paul Revere, and we found all sorts of iconic survivals of that ride. We found the saddlebags of Paul Revere. We found the messages that he carried. We found his spectacles. We found the authentic spurs of Paul Revere in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Then we found the authentic spurs of Paul Revere in the Smithsonian. And they kept growing in that way. But the first is just to have a look at this man. And I'm only going to show you one image tonight, and this is the one. This is Copley's painting. I'm sure you've seen it before, of Paul Revere. It was around the year 1770 that it was painted. And he was a man of some considerable means. He had great difficulty with his business from time to time. He nearly went bankrupt in 1765. But he could have, for his considerable wealth, have chosen to be painted in the usual dress of a gentleman. He was, in fact, when we see references to Paul Revere, in the Boston town meetings, they refer to him as Paul Revere, gentleman. But that wasn't the way he thought of himself, or the way I think he chose with Copley to represent his image here. We see him at his work. We see him dressed in what may have been something like his ordinary work clothing, except it was some of his better clothing. These are very elegant clothes that he's wearing, and they're solid gold buttons on that vest that he has. He's sitting at his work table, but it's a beautiful piece of maybe mahogany, or it could be walnut, and he has the tools of his trade in front of him. But the painting also is something else. It's a set of very complicated reflections that Copley created there. And we can see that Paul Revere himself is looking very reflectively out at us, and then we see that he's reflected on the surface of his work table, and his hands are reflected in the surface of that silver teapot that he has made. We see there is reflected also in that teapot a window that's looking out over the city of Boston. And we can also see Paul Revere looking out reflectively in just that way. And Copley, I think, was beginning to explore something of the very complicated life of this man in that moment that we remember. He was a bundle of paradoxes. He was the son of a French immigrant, and also the son of an old stock American. His mother went back to the Great Migration, the Puritan migration. His father, Apollo Revere, was his name. Changed his name to Paul Revere. He said he said the bumpkins can pronounce it that way. That's the way he changed it in New England. He was very much. He was, in the language of the 18th century, he was a mechanic, which at that time meant a man who worked with his hands, as always he did. But at the same time, he was called a gentleman, but it was not the sort of gentleman that people thought of in Europe. This was a gentleman that was not so much of a social rank as of a kind of moral condition. It was a man who was known for what he did in his community and how he got on with others. He was a moralist and a hedonist. He was a church-going animal. He also knew the insides of most of the taverns in the town. He was a man who worked to keep order in the town, but he also was convicted of assault when people insulted him, and he settled those questions himself in the early American way. He was a family man. He had 2 wives. Each wife produced 8 children, 16 in all. 5 of them died, 6 of them died in infancy, that is in the first year. Another 6 died in childhood. But the rest increased and multiplied so rapidly that Paul Revere had 50 grandchildren. 50 grandchildren, if you can imagine that. And those grandchildren increased and multiplied, and I keep running into them as I talk about Paul Revere, and these are strong genes. I have been to Texas, and I have seen people in 10-gallon hats who look as if they stepped out of that Copley painting, and they really identify very closely with this man. He was also involved in he belonged to almost everything that a man could belong to in Boston. Not only to the church and to these many tavern societies, he belonged to fraternal organizations, a very active Mason. He was involved he belonged to the caucus. He lived on the North End, and there was in each of the neighborhoods in Boston, there was a group called the caucus, which nominated other men to office, public office. And he was in the North Caucus, and he was the man who did the liaison between the North Caucus and the South Caucus and the Central Caucus, which kept him pretty busy just in all of that. On top of those things, he was the man who was consulted, mechanic that he was, when things needed fixing. There was increasing difficulty in the streets of Boston because they were pitch dark at night, and so the town decided that it needed to have street lights. And the man who was put in charge of lighting the streets of Boston was Paul Revere. He didn't go to the Latin school. He didn't go to Harvard. He didn't have the classical education that set another group of men apart at the top of this pyramid. But in other ways, he had a very, very long reach in the town. He also had an opponent who was in every way worthy of him in this story. And this was General Thomas Gage, and he becomes the central figure on the British side in Boston in 1775. We've got to know Thomas Gage very well. He sent every year, he was first commander-in-chief of the British armies in America, and then he was appointed after the Tea Party, was appointed Royal Governor of Massachusetts to restore New England to its proper place as they thought of it in the empire. And every year he had a big pine box built and sent back to Britain with his papers, all the papers for that year. And all of those boxes have survived, and the papers in them. And they were bought by a timber baron in Michigan named William Clements. And they all now in a Greek temple on the Ann Arbor campus. It's called the William L. Clements Library. And there are the records of this man, Thomas Gage. And he and Paul Revere, on opposite sides in the Revolution, both were men of deep principle. General Gage was a man who always was faithful to the Whig settlement of 1688. He believed in government by king in parliament, was the phrase. He believed in the rule of law, in the sovereignty of king in parliament as the source and protector of that law. And he was also deeply committed to what he called the common rights of mankind. General Thomas Gage in 1775 talking that way. But he was appalled by the Tea Party. He thought it was a lawless act and had to be stopped. And that was the business that he was in. And Paul Revere was a man who was in the same way devoted to the idea of another system of law by representatives of the people of Massachusetts, an idea of law that was embodied in what we would call the Charter. We know how Paul Revere spoke. We can hear him in his spelling. And he spelled in a very idiosyncratic way. And charter was spelt chatta. And we can hear him saying words like chatta, or once he was writing about a marsh, and it came out mash. And in that New England accent, that Boston accent that we know so well. But Paul Revere had that sense of charter rights. And one of the things that the British had done had been to deny Massachusetts its charter. And so these two men and the men around them were going toward a direct collision, both of them driven by ideas of law and right conduct in the world, absolutely certain of the rectitude of what they were trying to do. But they were doing it in different ways. And General Gage, born into the aristocracy, was accustomed to a top-down sort of system, to one in which was elaborately hierarchical. Paul Revere was living in a town that was organized in a very different way, run by its town meeting, in which he was very active. And so we see them having two different purposes. And the question was, how were they going to try to restore peace? Each of them trying to do that in two opposite ways. And General Gage thought that the first thing he would do, he was a general who had seen some of the worst fighting in the 18th century. He hated war. If you look at his portrait, you see a kind of world weariness in his eyes from the horrors that he had witnessed. And what he intended to do was to solve the problem of America by stopping a revolution before it started, preventing a war from happening. And he thought that there was a pretty good way of doing that, and the way would be to disarm these New England Yankees, who were in fact armed to the teeth at that time. And they had a great abundance of weapons, but they were desperately short of gunpowder. Powder could not be manufactured in the American colonies at that time. It wouldn't be until just a little bit later that was done. So General Gage thought that he would try to bring peace to Massachusetts by confiscating some of its major supplies of powder. And then also he thought that if they were going to make serious trouble with his troops, they would do it with artillery, and there was a fair amount of that. So he thought he would go after those field guns that might be used against him. And that was the way it started on September 1st, 1774. And General Gage arranged a very top secret operation against a powder magazine, which was it's very near the campus of Tufts University today. The building still stands. And he sent a very large expedition that arrived without being detected. And it got into the powder magazine and removed it, carried much of it out by water back to the fort that was in Boston Harbor. And then his troops retreated to the city. And the New Englanders were shocked by that. They deeply believed in the right to keep and bear arms. For them, it meant the collective right to keep and bear arms. It meant the necessity of arms, that is, that the cartridge box was as important as a ballot box to them as a guarantee of their freedom. And the result was one of the first of the alarms, like the Lexington alarm, but it was called the powder alarm on September 1st. And the militia mustered from as far west as Springfield, Massachusetts, and converged on Boston. The Whig leader saw what was happening and persuaded these men to leave their weapons in Watertown to prevent an explosion before its time. But others, the leaders of the revolutionary movement that begins to develop, were conscious of the fact that they had been taken completely by surprise. And they organized the first American intelligence service in Boston to watch General Gage. And the head of the intelligence service was Paul Revere. He was appointed to organize the mechanics of the town, who patrolled the streets and worked out other ways so that they were continuously keeping watch over the movements of the British in Boston. And the man who was put in charge of organizing it in so many of these ways was Paul Revere. I was looking at the various leaders of the revolution, and there are others who are much more prominent than Paul Revere at the top of the pile, and that would have been people like Samuel Adams and John Hancock. And I made a table. It's in the back of my book. It goes on for too many pages in the back of the book, but it's a list of all the major figures in the revolution, and it's a matrix of all the associations that they belonged to. And there were two men who were much more active in associations than anybody else in town. And one of them was Dr. Joseph Warren, and the other was Paul Revere. And these two men were in a position much more actively embedded in the social life of the town than were Samuel Adams, who was very prominent in the town meeting, or John Hancock, who was supporting the cause with his wealth. And we see Paul Revere being used that way. Then there were a series of other events, and we don't have time to go through them in great detail. But what was happening was that General Gage kept trying to acquire more of these weapons and powder supplies, and he tried to do it in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And just before his men got there had been a messenger who'd come from Boston, and it was Paul Revere who showed up. And they're getting so frustrated that they refer to him, they being the British leaders, refer to him in their correspondence just by his initials. It was PR again, they said, who was getting there. And it was done in such a way that the British got none of the powder in New Hampshire. It was spirited away to the countryside just in the nick of time. And then as General Gage is at the same time shutting down the government of Massachusetts, as well as confiscating the charter, the leaders of the revolutionary movement organized their own improvised government of the colony. And they founded a body that was called the Massachusetts Provincial Congress. And it had committees. There was a committee of safety and a committee of supplies, and these became the governing bodies of Massachusetts. There were two governments now. There was the government that General Gage headed, and there was the other government that was organized in this way. And they began to acquire more weapons and hid them in various towns around Boston. And it was clear General Gage there was a very complicated process of intelligence and counterintelligence in which these two groups are watching each other. But then the American leaders are also thinking about something else. They were conscious of the fact that the success of their movement hinged fundamentally on what their generation was the first to call popular opinion or public opinion. And they thought that there was very likely to be an outbreak of violence. And it was urgently important that the violence should happen in such a way that people could agree that the Whig side, the American side, as they hadn't, that the Whig side would have a moral advantage. They were deeply conscious of the importance of the moral advantage over one's opponents. Samuel Adams had learned that lesson in the Boston town meeting, and he wrote a letter to his friends in Virginia. He said, "Put your enemy in the wrong and keep him there." a good rule in politics as well as war. And that was what they were going to try to do. And they thought that it was only a matter of time before General Gage would be sending out these various detachments from his growing garrison to take possession of more of these supplies of weapons, and that it was only a matter of time before they actually met in battle with the American militia, who were multiplying rapidly in the towns. And they were determined that when that happened, that the first violence would come from the British and not from the Americans. And Paul Revere begins to make rides. He made at least 12 rides. You'll see a table at the back of my book on all of this. And these were rides that were not merely trying to establish mobilization, but they were also carrying the instructions from those bodies, the conventions and the Congress, the provincial Congress, and from the Committee of Safety, that when the British moved into the countryside, that the militia should muster and constitute themselves what was called an army of observation, But they were to be armed, and their weapons were to be loaded. But they were not to fire, absolutely not to fire the first shot. And that was one of the messages that Paul Revere was carrying on many of these trips. He made at least 5 trips to Concord in these weeks before the fighting began. And he was carrying that message. And the message spread to the captains of the town militia companies. And then on the night, finally, General Gage was being very slow to send these groups out, his major detachments into the countryside, and he works at it with great hesitation. He was also increasingly getting orders from England to be much more aggressive and to arrest the leaders of the revolution. In particular, he was instructed to arrest Samuel Adams and John Hancock. And General Gage refused. He said they had broken no law. This was a man who believed in law, which was not quite the case with his superiors in London. And he refused to do that. But the Americans, this intelligence service, knew about the orders that went to General Gage, though they didn't know about his response. And they thought that, in fact, he was going to be sending men out to round up these revolutionary leaders. And that takes us to the 18th of April, when a spy in General Gage's household, probably a female, we have accounts of her as a daughter of liberty, unequally yoked in marriage, quote unquote. And we've been wondering who she might have been. And I have some speculation about that. General Gage had an American wife. And I think it's at least possible that she may have been the source of that news about the letter from London for the arrest, calling for the arrest of the Whig leaders. And that news was carried to Dr. Warren, and he asked Paul Revere to get it out to Lexington, where Sam Adams and John Hancock had been meeting with the Committee of Safety. And they were instructed, they sent out 2 messengers. And there's been much discussion about the 2, William Dawes and Paul Revere. But then I began to study the people who actually were carrying messages that night. And we started with 2, and at the moment, it keeps growing. At the moment, we have identified 60 riders who were out that night. And they don't in any way diminish these individual figures who we know about, because Paul Revere was organizing again, and he set many of them in motion. And then when he went off on his ride, every place he went, was a place where several other riders went in turn, and further riders were engaged as well. Women were active in this. Slaves were active in spreading the word. There was an enormous network that was set in motion, and the network was not only spreading the news that the regulars were coming out, but they were also spreading the news that it was very important that the regulars should fire the first shot. That was the center. It was the center of a kind of moral enterprise couched in the idea of public opinion that was so vitally important in this moment. And then Paul Revere went off. He was captured, got loose, ended up on Lexington Green, just as Captain Parker was mustering his company. And we have eyewitness accounts. What would happen, it's interesting to see the way these militia companies worked. They almost had a kind of town meeting on Lexington Green when they were told to muster and prepare to be that army of observation when the British came in their direction. And we actually hear in Paul Revere's description of Captain Parker saying, he said in that Yankee idiom, he said, "Fire not lest they fire first. Do not fire till they fire first. Make sure you do not fire the first shot." And those words were spreading rapidly through that evening. And Paul Revere was constantly given new and urgent tasks when John Hancock and Samuel Adams were encouraged to disappear in the general direction of Woburn, Massachusetts, which they did. That John Hancock forgot that he left the trunk with all the secret correspondence of the committee in Lexington. So they asked a person to rescue the trunk, and that was, again, Paul Revere. And as the British troops approached the edge of Lexington Common, Paul Revere and a friend of his were carrying this huge, heavy trunk of John Hancock right through the lines of the militia. And again, they heard the militia being told not to fire the first shot. And the trunk, they continued to take the trunk back, and as they continued, the first shot was fired. We do not know who fired the first shot. Everybody's got a theory. One thing that's interesting is that virtually all of the depositions, and they were taken in great numbers, by the American Minutemen, or militia, there were no Minutemen in Lexington, but the militia all agreed that the British troops did not fire the first shot. And on the other side, virtually all of the British troops agreed that the American militia in their ranks did not fire the first shot, but somebody else did. And we don't know who it could have been. There are a couple of people who are getting more attention than others. One was a British officer who was a volunteer there. He didn't have to be there. He went of his own free will, and he got a horse from a Yankee barn, and it was a horse he was having great difficulty controlling, and he had a pistol in his hand. And Paul Revere was asked to give a deposition as to who fired the first shot. He said, "I don't know, I didn't see it, but I think I heard a pistol." And that's one possibility. The other possibility, the British thought it was a musket that was fired not from the militia, but from Buckman's Tavern. And there were some people standing watching all of this. One of them was a bored adolescent named Solomon Brown. And Solomon Brown he was spoiled. He had his own horse, as kids today have their own cars. He also had his own weapon, and he was standing there, and it is thought that Solomon Brown may have fired the first shot before the innkeeper threw him out. And that's another possibility. We don't know who did that. But we see again and again the Americans trying to do that. The next collision was on the land above the Concord Bridge. And the Americans there were mustered, and they were told, do not fire the first shot. And then they saw that the British were beginning to tear up the planks on the bridge. The British were at the bottom of that long hill. And the Americans had built that bridge. And they shouted, leave the bridge alone. And the British kept at it, and so the Americans came down in a very controlled military formation. And the British fired the first shot there. A couple of infantrymen panicked at the bridge, and all of that was made known. And the Americans kept trying to work at that and kept losing control. There were some very bad things that happened, small atrocities that began to happen as the struggle went on. But we can see the Americans continuing to try to put the enemy in the wrong and keep him there. And that was the word that they were able to spread outward, and it made it look like an act of British aggression, and it was so perceived. They did other things as well. At the same time, they were keenly aware of getting their message to the public, and so they hired some of the fastest sailing ships that they could find in Massachusetts. And they got the American version of those events to Europe and to Britain weeks before General Gage got in his report. And virtually all of the early information about what had happened in Lexington and Concord came from these men who were deeply interested in public opinion, in putting the enemy in the wrong and keeping there. They're also interested in a kind of leadership in which moral conduct becomes critical in the way that they conduct themselves. And they kept doing that for an extended period. And then I wanted to go on today and to have a quick look at another of these events in which, let's see, do I have, this is what I'm looking for, in which this is another iconic event. It's like these other, like the Paul Revere ride. These are two events that were respected. All the Aristotelian unities of time and place and action. They have a kind of tightness about these things. And it's about General Washington. It's a bit blurry here, but I think you can make out the people in that boat. And here was General George Washington getting a new job, which was to lead a Continental Army. The people who chose him for that job were Samuel Adams and John Adams in the Continental Congress. They also worked with in very complex congressional negotiations so that George Washington was not only elected to that job, but he was elected unanimously. And they were behind the process by which George Washington became the unanimously chosen commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. He would be unanimously chosen head of the Constitutional Convention. He was unanimously elected the first president, and he was unanimously elected the second president. That is, for a second term. That is unanimous in the Electoral College, and it was a record that was without equal in American history. And it was one in which New Englanders had a hand. They also had a hand in shaping this army that crossed the Delaware River. George Washington was picked as a Virginian to command an army in 1775, in the summer of 1775, which was predominantly a New England army, and he commanded at the siege of Boston. He was sure it was going to be a disaster. General Washington and these New England leaders could not have been more distant in so many ways. And General Washington, when he took that job, he was standing at the back of the Continental Congress next to Patrick Henry, and he turned to Patrick Henry and he said, "Depend upon it, Mr. Henry, from this date you may date the ruin of my reputation." And he was sure that the task of commanding these Yankees would be extremely difficult. And they spoke of each other as if they were from foreign countries. George Washington came from that northern neck of Virginia. It was a huge area. It was measured in its length in degrees of longitude, 3 degrees of longitude, and it belonged to one family, the Fairfax family. And the Washingtons worked for that, and it was as top-down as any system anywhere in the world, and very different from New England with its town meetings and its distribution of wealth as so unlike that. And that when George Washington arrived, he was appalled at the sight of the New England troops. He said, "They are a dirty people," he said. He spoke of them as if they were alien from his experience. They were appalled by the manners of General Washington, and they sang verses of Yankee Doodle that are not sung by children today, that were about General Washington. They called him Captain Washington on his slapping stallion. And he had a very difficult time commanding that army that was mostly New Englanders. And it got more difficult when the Virginians began to arrive from the backcountry. And many of the New England troops included slaves who were given their freedom in many cases. You'll see one, I don't know if you can quite make him out, but here in the bow of this boat is an African American who is wearing a uniform that tells us that he belonged to a regiment of Marblehead Mariners. And the New Englanders continued to dominate the Continental Army. In this group that crossed the Delaware with Washington, 60% were New Englanders. And they had a continuous problem. And then when these people from the backcountry, many of them from Virginia, were slaveholders and were bivouacked next to slaves who were carrying weapons. And it was an explosive situation in which it suddenly erupted into a full-fledged riot. George Washington, with his closest companion, who was his slave, William Lee, rode into the center of this riot, and he leaped off his horse, and it was said he grabbed a Virginian in one hand and a New Englander in the other, and according to the eyewitness account, he, quote, spoke with them, end quote. And they fled in different directions, and he put an end to that crisis in his army. But the problem was how to run a Continental Army, particularly when he was up against the very first team, and he truly was. The more we learned about these British commanders, the more respect I think we have to give them. They were very good at their jobs. They had just won the war that preceded the American Revolution with a victory without equal in the early modern period over other European powers. And Washington was up against that first team, and he had a team that was deeply divided against itself. And he had a great success at the beginning with the Siege of Boston. He won that one. And then he had an epic disaster in New York. Everything went wrong. The intelligence failed, logistics failed. The camp discipline was the worst of it. The army got sick, and he started with 35,000 men. He lost battle after battle, and finally carried what remained in a retreat in November of 1776 across New Jersey, heading west to the Delaware River. And as he went, he asked this man who's holding the flag, that's another Virginia gentleman, it's the lieutenant of James Monroe, who was a lieutenant of infantry in that unit. And Washington asked Monroe to stand by the side of the road in Newark, New Jersey, and count the army. And he had started with 35,000 men. He had 3,000 left. He'd lost 90% of his army. And he went across the Delaware and then began to think about how he possibly could keep it going. He really doubted that it could be done. He wrote home to Mount Vernon. He said, "Be prepared to carry everything into the mountains." He said the game is pretty near up. This in early December of 1776. And then he began to think about how to deal with this army that was so difficult for him to lead. And he wrote home to a member of his family, and he said, I've learned something working with these New England men. He said, he summarized it in one sentence. He said, a people unaccustomed to restraint cannot be drove, they must be led. And what he did was to begin to develop another kind of open leadership that was really very similar in some ways to what people like Paul Revere and the other leaders in New England had been working at before. He invented a new kind of council of war. That was the way soldiers led armies in this period. And the councils in the British army were very folksy gatherings. They'd all been to school together. They called themselves by their school nicknames. But the guy who was in command usually announced what he wanted to accomplish, and then they talked about how to do that. Washington began to operate in this crisis in a way that I think was partly inspired by these New England men. And what he did was to begin not by framing a plan, but by framing a problem. And then he invited people to discuss the problem, to debate possibilities for dealing with it. Everybody knew who was running the Continental Army. Nobody doubted that General Washington was in command. But but he decided that the only way he could make his command work was by this open way of doing it. And then he did other things as well. What he did was to organize an intelligence service. He'd been totally defeated in intelligence in New York. And he ordered his major generals to construct their own, to run their own agents. And unlike many other services in which people try to keep intelligence centralized and to control it because they're controlling power in that way, George Washington decentralized intelligence. And they began to produce results. And there was a lot of trouble brewing for the British in New Jersey, where they'd occupied the state. And in that process, they were alienating many people who lived in New Jersey and had been in the process of changing sides toward the British before that time. They were short of provisions. They were at a 3,000-mile supply chain, and it wasn't working. And they began to forage, and the forage turned into theft, and the theft turned into violence, and the violence into rape and murder. And the people of New Jersey began to have had it with these British occupiers. And General Washington began to learn about what was going on through this improved intelligence service. He put people to work on the question of how these men who had so little experience, the officers had maybe 1 or 2 years experience, the British had 20 years experience, how they could stand against so formidable an opponent. And it was the same difference in terms of the discipline of the army in general. And they invented a new system of tactics. The Americans had a great abundance of artillery. This had been accumulating in the seaports in America, as most American ships that went to sea were armed with batteries that could be mounted on wheels. And so they created a system in which the U.S. Army began to march with much more in the way of artillery than either the Hessians or the British had. They greatly changed the relationship of the number of infantry to the number of guns. And the guns allowed these very green infantry units to rally around them. And they used that as well. There were a dozen other things that were being done. Some of them succeeded, some of them failed. But there was a new and much more open system of communication in which General Washington was beginning to organize a system that was a little bit like the way Paul Revere and other people were organizing Massachusetts against General Gage. And then they took the Hessians by surprise at Trenton and captured that garrison, or 2/3 of it. And General Washington suddenly had a new problem. He had 900 prisoners of war, And what should he do with them? The British had been very hard on prisoners that they had caught. They didn't recognize the right of the rebels to fight against them. And often prisoners were shot or bayoneted as a consequence. General Washington announced, he said that that the U.S. Army, the Continental Army, will operate on a new policy which he called the policy of humanity, the policy of humanity. And it was grounded on the fact that, on the idea that these Hessian opponents of the American Revolution were entitled to at least one of the rights that the revolution was about, which was the right to life itself. And General Washington guaranteed humane treatment of the Hessians. They were amazed. They expected the worst. And then there was another battle at Princeton that followed, and there were hundreds of British captives as well. And they also were given this policy of humanity. It didn't work all the way through the Revolution, and there were some very bad scenes, particularly in the West and in the South, where it broke down. But where the Continental Army was fighting, they fought on the basis of this policy of humanity. What General Washington was trying to do was to put the enemy in the wrong and keep him there, and to appeal to the power of fighting for the right, which was what those American leaders had done in Trenton. And I think they were beginning to build a new way of leading in all of this. It was a way in which ethics was built into it from the very start, and in which ethics became a kind of instrument, and public opinion was its object. And they were doing that with increasing success. And Washington mastered this style of leadership and made it, gave it a kind of identity in its linkage with his character, as also did many of these New Englanders as well. And when we see all that happening, we see the beginnings of an American tradition. And it's a tradition that has gone on for a very long time in this country. Sometimes it's broken apart. Sometimes it's failed us. Sometimes we've gone in a different way. But it seems to me that it's urgent that we remember what we have done in the past, and particularly that we remember that in the present today. And I'll stop at that point, and I hope you all have thoughts and questions and challenges and whatever else. And thank you for inviting me. So do we have time for questions? Yes? Yeah. Yes. Anybody, please, who's going to start? Let me put, yes, stand up and shout.
Sure. When he lit the streets of Boston, did he lay gas lines? Is that how he did it?
I'm sorry, can you say that again?
When he lit the streets of Boston, did he lay gas?
No gas. This was mostly whale oil that he used. Whale oil lamps. It was done. It actually worked. Other questions? Do I see a hand? Let me put my
I
long.
had the pleasure of hearing you talk in Concord when your book on Paul Revere first came out. And I know there was some, as always, Concord and Lexington people in the audience were debating a few of the points that you made in the book. Has there been any changes?
Yes, there's been been a great rivalry for. There was one irony in all of that. Concord and Lexington had worked very hard at not firing the first shot. Then, after it was fired, they wanted to claim the honor of being the first to fire back. And so this became a huge rivalry that went on for generations. And you'll see it, one of the oldest of the monuments, I think, went up, and I think the year was 1798 on Lexington Green. And it makes clear the claim of Lexington to priority that way. And but the Concordians are not are more determined than ever to.
At the time your book came out and you were speaking in Concord, there was a rumor floating around town that you were negotiating with Steven Spielberg to have a movie of Paul Revere's writing.
Yes.
Whatever happened?
That's true. We did. We took Paul Revere, got the attention. I think what happened was a wonderful show on All Things Considered, which when the book was published, the year was 1994, and Hollywood listened, and we had a bidding war for Paul Revere, and the problem and then Steven Spielberg made an option, an offer for an option, which we accepted and began to go forward with it. The problem is we could not get a script that pleased everybody, and the script writers were mostly English majors, and they were really very good at scripts. But they did things such as thinking that they suggested that Dr. Warren actually sneaked out to Lexington Green and fired the first shot himself. And this added a certain dramatic intensity to the film, but there were objections of that sort. I think there were other difficulties. We spent an afternoon. Judy and I spent a day with Steven Spielberg, walking the battlefield. He was deeply interested, and we went out to the Wayside Inn, which is on the Sudbury-Marlborough line. It was an inn that actually half of it is still just as it was. In 1776. And we went into the kitchen and had lunch in the kitchen, which was very much like an 18th century kitchen. And I remember a conversation that went on, I think it went on for 2 hours. Mostly it was Steven Spielberg talking about light, talking on the subject of light. And it was one of the most extraordinary experiences I think I have ever had. And they're really wonderful people. People at the center in Hollywood are supremely good at their jobs. But the failure rate in films, I'm told, is approximately 95%. And we joined the majority that way. And I have always regretted that we were unable to engage Steven Spielberg's genius with the American Revolution. I think he was much more comfortable with events. He's deeply interested in history, and he was much more comfortable with historical events in the 20th century. And I think that was another a part of it that might have been a factor. We get a new offer for a film almost on an annual basis, and we have signed more than a few of them, and and none of them have worked out. And I scratch my head at that, though we are happy to receive an offer of an option, and it has paid for other books as we continue to scribble. So, yes.
Before Longfellow immortalized Paul Revere, was Paul Revere well known?
Yes, Paul Revere was very well known in his time. And he was not. He was frustrated that people greatly valued what he did, but he wanted to have a command in the Continental Army. And there was a problem that way. One problem was that there were so many New Englanders. The last thing George Washington needed was another Yankee in the army. And he was given a commission as a colonel of Massachusetts troops. And his career in the war was not his great success. He had a terrible experience in Maine. There was a disaster, the Penobscot campaign, in which he was deeply involved. But in other ways, he was actually accused of cowardice and of other dishonorable acts, and he demanded a court-martial, and the court-martial acquitted him, but he did not hold another commission after that. But he went on to do many other things. He became hugely successful. He had a brilliant way of seeing economic opportunities. He shifted from his silver and goldsmithing to, amongst other things, bell founding. And I'm told that this church has the first Paul Revere bell that was erected in the state of Vermont. And there were many, many Paul Revere bells that went up all over the place. And then he founded another company that became the Revere Copper and Brass Company. And he had a career in business and also in the development of a metal technology industry in America that was of high importance. And I think he was highly respected that way through his life. I think they deliberately tried to understate what they had done. That was another part of this style of leadership. And he rarely spoke of it, though he was almost coerced into writing 3 depositions that described what he had done. But people knew of Paul Revere and held him in high esteem.
In your mind of the current crop of actors, who would you think would make a good Paul Revere on the screen?
Who would say that again? Who would make a good Paul Revere?
On the screen of the current crop of actors we have.
I'm the wrong person to ask about that. I don't know enough about my choices, I think. And there were the usual suspects for Spielberg films were all prominently mentioned for the role. And Harrison Ford was thought to have been the likely choice there. I don't know Mr. Ford.
The question I have is, you told us about 2 different words at the beginning of your talk. One was debunking.
Debunking, yes.
And what was the other one?
The other was filiopietism. Filiopietism. Filiopiety, or the filiopietism. A piety for one's ancestors.
There's a movie with Jeff Bridges playing Washington called The Crossing.
Yes.
I thought it was quite good. What did you think?
Yes, it was a lively film, I thought. It's based on a work of more or less historical fiction, but I thought it was to the traditional interpretation that centered very much on the crossing of the Delaware. And we're now thinking about what happened as not merely a battle, but a campaign, which went on for about 4 months. And so it has greatly grown beyond that way of framing it. But I thought it was a serious attempt. It's a very tough business to be in. So many people have to be satisfied in so many ways. Another reason for the failure of films about the American Revolution, with a few exceptions, but one of the major sources of income is overseas sales. And I was told that the studio, it was Paramount, was the studio that we were dealing with in the first round. There were other rounds as well. But that the studios function more or less as the bankers in these things. And the bankers were concerned about income from overseas sales for Paul Revere. And we also found, I find that I'm always amazed that Paul Revere in this country is pretty much of a New England hero. That is, Texans have not much heard of Paul Revere. There's a Texas joke about Paul Revere. That Paul Revere, wasn't he the Yankee who had to ride for help? So I think there is. It's not merely that it's an American story, but it's a regional. It's regional in its intensity. Washington is something else. So.
I read your book. I've read it several times, and
The Paul Revere book.
yeah. And I love when you wrote at the end of the book about the famous grandsons of some of the men who had been involved in the militia. I wondered if you could go over Melville and.
I think it's really interesting to see how this tradition has perpetuated itself from generation to generation. And then there are other periods when that process seems not to be working so well. And the question is what to do about that. What to do about the recovery of these memories of leadership in our time. And I remember as an elementary school student during World War II that we all spent quite a lot of time in what was then called civics class. And I don't think civics classes exist by that name. I think they probably exist in other ways. But I think one thing we need to do is to think about reviving a kind of civic consciousness in this republic. And I think we have to think about that partly in educational terms. Also reviving a sense of the ethical dimension of leadership. And I think there are as many honorable leaders in our time as in any other. And yet that tradition is not as strong as it needs to be. And the question is, what might we do about it? We have just introduced a new program in my university, Brandeis University, for what is called global citizenship. But we've got some troubles at home that I think need attention as well. And we're not doing nearly as well as we might to prepare people today for their role as citizens. I wonder if you all have ideas about how we might come to terms with that. I think that's as critical as any problem that we're facing today. And not only today, I've been writing recently, my two last books were about open societies in the world. Open societies there was a phrase that began to reverberate after World War I, as many societies became open in the sense of being committed to the rule of law, to the election of leaders, and to in human rights. And there were something like 22 of those open systems in the early 1920s, many of them created after World War I. And by 1933, there were only 2 that remained on the continent of Europe. And then they began to grow again very rapidly from 1975 on. And they've been growing up to 2008. And then they began to shrink again. And the numbers have been declining. But as I travel around the world, and we were invited to China, Judy and I, to lecture in Chinese universities about liberty and freedom, if you can believe that. This was in 2007, just before the Olympics. And we talked with many Chinese students, and they talked to us about, they said, after I would talk about our leaders, and the hands would shoot up, they'd say, thank you for telling us about Jefferson and Lincoln and Washington. Now let us tell you about Confucius. And what they were doing was developing a new kind of an open society that for the future of China, that would be grounded in Chinese traditions, and it would be unlike any open society the world has ever seen, but it would be genuinely open. And to hear these young and very enthusiastic Chinese students talk about that is to get a sense of faith for what could happen in the world. But all of that, since 2008, that's been slipping a bit. And I think we can, the question is how can we sort of turn that around? And it's a question of not merely in this country, but of open societies around the world. And we can see how something of the strains we've been seeing here are being felt widely in Europe and in other places as well. And yet I think we can also see an opportunity, because I think so many people in the world want open systems, not like ours, never twice the same. And I think that's a great way forward if we can seize the opportunity.
Thank you so much for an incredible evening. You've reminded us all of the power of story and stories of leadership and how important they are to our civic society, so thank you. After our program tonight, we're going to ring the Revere bell. So don't run away so you can have that chance. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.